Hi, this is Mrs. P, and I'm going to read to you. This book is called The Biggest Pumpkin Ever by Stephen Kroll, illustrated by Jenny Bassett. This is kind of a long story, so settle in. The biggest pumpkin ever. The biggest pumpkin ever. There's our title page. So here's a little mouse. He's in his house, and he's looking at his garden. Once, there were two mice who fell in love with the same pumpkin. Look, I want to show you this. There's a little pumpkin growing right there. I bet that's the one. Let's turn the page and see. Clayton, the village mouse, noticed it one day in his parents' vegetable garden. It was still little and green, but Clayton thought he would make it grow really big. It might even get big enough to win the grand prize at the town pumpkin contest. And so when it's in a little bubble like that, he's just kind of thinking that. He's daydreaming, thinking, woohoo. Desmond, the field mouse, discovered the pumpkin the same day. He thought that if he helped it grow, it could become the biggest jack-o'-lantern in the neighborhood. And there he is, around the same little pumpkin. You know, one thing I want you to notice, though, is Desmond, the little field mouse, he is just excited to think that maybe he can do something that would be fun for the neighborhood. Whereas Clayton is just kind of thinking, wow, look at everybody. You'll think I'm cool because I won a ribbon. So let's see how this goes. That afternoon, Clayton watered the pumpkin, and he also mixed up some fertilizer of manure and water, and he spread the mixture around the pumpkin to make it grow larger. Desmond didn't want to be seen by Clayton and his family, so he waited until after dark before he crept into the garden. He watered the pumpkin, too. He also spread some manure mixed with water around it. You know, the bad thing about that is when you put too much manure on there, sometimes it burns the plant and it just doesn't do well at all. The next day, Clayton watered and fertilized the pumpkin again. The next night, Desmond did the same. And the pumpkin began to grow. And so it grew, and it grew, and it grew. And by the end of a month, the pumpkin was so large, Clayton couldn't believe his eyes. Well, my goodness, said Clayton's mother. And it's not even full grown. Clayton shrugged. All I do is water it, he said. Clayton's mother whispered in his ear, if you want the pumpkin to grow bigger and faster, you should use sugar water. That night, Desmond brought his brother Morris to see the pumpkin. Morris knew everything there was to know about growing things. That's some pumpkin, he said. Desmond shrugged. All I do is water it, he said. And Morris whispered in his ear, you should try using sugar water, he said. The next day, Clayton dug a small hole beside the pumpkin vine. In the hole, he placed a bowl full of sugar water. He cut into the vine a few inches from the pumpkin, and in the cut, he put in one piece of a candle wick. Then he put the other end in the bowl of sugar water. That night, on the other side of the pumpkin, Desmond did exactly the same thing. And within a week, the pumpkin was twice the size it had been. Within 2 weeks, it was absolutely enormous. Clayton was amazed. He ran down the road and he peeked into his friend Jimmy's pumpkin patch. The pumpkin Jimmy was growing for the contest looked much smaller. Clayton scratched his head. "I have an amazing pumpkin," he said out loud, "and I think I'm going to win the contest." That night, Desmond and his brother Morris spent a long time looking at the pumpkin. "How do you think it got that big?" Desmond asked. Morris shrugged. "A little luck, a little skill." "It's going to make some jack-o'-lantern," said Desmond. "It sure is," said Morris. A week later, Clayton noticed the pumpkin was bigger than the family car. During the day, everyone he knew came over to admire it. And at night, all the field mice gathered round to do the same thing. By now, summer was almost over. In the week, the pumpkin would be full grown and start turning yellowish and then orange. A few weeks after that, it should be ripe and ready for the pumpkin contest. Clayton could hardly wait. The pumpkin was growing so fast, it would soon be larger than his house. And then he had a terrible thought. If the pumpkin was so big, how would he get it to the contest? It wouldn't fit in his red wagon. It wouldn't even fit in a truck. Clayton decided to worry about this when the time came. Well, look at that pumpkin. Look at his house. Look at his truck. It's tiny. Pumpkin, truck. Pumpkin, truck. I don't think it's going to happen, do you? I'm going to show you this and I'll read it. That night, the weather grew colder. Thinking there might be an early frost, Clayton rushed out to the pumpkin with his blanket. One was not enough, and soon he was rushing back and forth, carrying all the blankets from the house. As he worked, he hummed a little song, and as he hummed, he heard somebody else singing. He also began to realize that someone was covering the pumpkin with blankets. Desmond, too, had seen the danger of an early frost, and he, too, had brought blankets for the pumpkin, and as he worked, he sang a little song, and as he sang, he began to realize that someone else was working and humming. Clayton stopped humming. He put down his pile of blankets and peered around the corner of the pumpkin. Desmond stopped singing. He put down his blankets and peered around the corner of the pumpkin. The two of them bumped heads and fell down. "You've been feeding the pumpkin," said Clayton. "You've been feeding the pumpkin," said Desmond. "That's why it's so big," said Clayton. "That's why it's so big," said Desmond, and they burst out laughing. When everything had been explained, Clayton said, "I know I'll win the contest if I can just get the pumpkin to town." And Desmond smiled and said, "I'll help you. Just let me carve the pumpkin into a jack-o'-lantern for Halloween when the contest is over." "It's a deal," said Clayton. "A deal," said Desmond, and they shook on it. In the morning of the contest was bright and sunny, and mice were bringing their pumpkins to the town square by truck and car and wagon, and some were rolling them on the ground. There's the pumpkin contest. There's all these little mice with their small pumpkins. Oh, this is funny. So here comes Clayton and Desmond's pumpkin. It's coming down the road, coming down the road. And suddenly they all stopped short. Over the fields came the biggest pumpkin anyone had ever seen. It was being pulled by 100 field mice on motorcycles. Boom, 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 boom. So how are they doing that? When the pumpkin reached town, it was too big for any of the streets. Clayton had to explain why he couldn't bring it to the square. The mayor understood at once, and he led the crowd to Clayton's pumpkin and pinned the first prize ribbon on its side. Then everyone danced around it. "Who would have believed this?" said Clayton as he danced. "Who would have believed this?" said Desmond at the same moment. And so they're getting a blue ribbon. Everybody's happy. Look at all that. They're all working. He's drawn out the image that he wants. When the celebration was over, the 100 field mice pulled the pumpkin back to the field, and the day before Halloween they carved it into the best jack-o'-lantern ever. And on Halloween night, its wonderful smiling face could be seen glowing for miles and miles around. And that is the end, boys and girls, of the biggest pumpkin ever. How fun, huh?